How
Yeah.
did you start with this work?
Well, so sorry. Um, it actually I never intended to specifically get into the realm of entheogens at like a public level. Um, I started my work with psychedelics. I usually identify that as beginning with cannabis when I was around 15. I do consider cannabis to be kind of a low-level psychedelic. Um, and had some early experiences there and was just really fascinated by it. Then when I was 18, I had my first experience with psilocybin mushrooms and worked with psilocybin mushrooms for a number of years and then eventually got into salvia divinorum. And then later, much later, got into 5-MeO, DMT, DMT, ayahuasca,
Mm.
peyote, MDMA, MDA, various synthetic molecules, things like that. Um, but to answer the question is, I got my degree in religious studies, and as a religious studies student, I was very interested in how psychedelics were used primarily within traditional cultures. I mean, in terms of the materials that were available at that time, I went to undergraduate school from 90 to 94, and then from 94 to 2000, I was a MA and PhD student. And at that point, really the only information I could find was various psychedelic plants and mushrooms that were used in the context of traditional indigenous cultures around the world. Now, at this point, we have a much better understanding that psychedelics have actually been a part of many of the much larger, more organized religions around the world, such as Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism. But at the time, mostly it was just these anthropological writings of, people that, well, I studied this tribe in the Amazon and they drank this thing called yahe or ayahuasca, or there's these groups, these indigenous cultures in Mexico that use peyote or salvia or mushrooms. So I considered that part of my personal education as a graduate student. Um, but again, to answer the question, things did not go very well between my graduate advisor and myself.
Mhm.
And it's a long, complicated story,
Mhm.
so I don't need to explain all of that at the moment, unless you're curious. But what that meant was that when I completed my PhD, my dissertation advisor worked really hard to make sure that I could not get a job in my area. And I had always assumed, oh, I'm going to get my PhD, I'm going to go on to be a professor at a university, this is what I'm going to teach, this is what I'm going to do. But I ended up out of graduate school, um, of all things, teaching English to international students at a private school in Santa Barbara. And I ended up going up through the ranks of the school and working for a couple different schools and became the academic director of one of these English language schools for international students. But honestly, it was not challenging. It was very boring. It did not interest me. So I ended up actually having a lot of free time on my hands. And one of the ways I filled my free time and not working in academics the way I was expecting is that after I completed graduate school, I started reading novels again. And I had not read a novel probably since high school because all of my reading was academic reading.
Mhm.
So, not knowing what to read, I started with the Dune series by Frank Herbert that I had read the original Dune book when I was in high school, and I thought, oh well, there's more books in that series. I'll read all of those. So I read all of those, and then I ended up even reading the ones produced by Frank Herbert's son, Brian Herbert, and another author. I forget his name at the moment. But I read all of those, and I loved all of those. And then I was at the point of, well, what am I going to read next? And I thought, well, okay, how about if I read the Silmarillion and then The Hobbit, and then I'll read the Lord of the Rings books. So I'm going to read all of Tolkien. And I read all of those. And after that, it was actually on a Tuesday night, and I just thought, you know what? I think I'll write my own fantasy epic. Why not? I mean, I'm not doing anything else. So that was the genesis of where I started as a writer, and I wrote this series of books called Tales of Arduin, and it's 4 books long. And after I finished writing that, what I realized was that I had taken not only of many of my own personal experiences with both salvia divinorum and psilocybin mushrooms, and I had written them into the books as experiences that other characters were having, but that I had also included, in a sense, everything that I had ever learned from working with these. And so at that point, it just kind of a light bulb went off in my head. Is like, you know what? I think I could extract a lot of the same information that I wrote into these novels, and I could write a book. And that, I have my stack of books over here. That became this book, Mushroom Wisdom. And the subtitle I did not choose. The publisher chose that, is How Shamans Cultivate Spiritual Consciousness. But really, I felt that I'd really grown a lot as a person spiritually through my experiences with psilocybin mushrooms. And at the time, this book was published towards the end of 2006. And one of the things that struck me at that time period was that there were lots of anthropological works about, these people use mushrooms. And then there was stuff like Terence McKenna, and really some stuff that I just considered kind of to be really far out and not really practical and not really useful. Like, there wasn't a handbook that said, if you want to explore your own spirituality through psychedelic mushrooms, here's how you do it. So I wrote the book with kind of this handbook or this manual idea that I want to make this really applicable for people who are kind of like me, who not coming from a spiritual religious background, not necessarily going to go live in the Amazon, but like to use psilocybin mushrooms and want to grow spiritually as a person. And so that book came out in 2006, and that kind of started my public involvement as someone involved in the psychedelic movement or in the entheogenic movement. And then after a series of events, I really made some big life changes in late 2007 and moved up here to Ashland at that time. And then in 2008, honestly, it was just part of my process of, I've moved somewhere where I don't know anyone and I don't have a job, and I left my job and I'm now divorced and paying child support, and I need to figure out what I'm going to do. One of the answers to that was I ended up creating the EntheogenicEvolution podcast. And now I've been doing that for 17 years. And in doing that podcast, I found, for one, there was a lot that I personally just wanted to share on the podcast. Like, I've got a lot to talk about. And then started inviting guests on as well. And then started working on other books within this area. And even after writing the Tales of Ardoin books, I have written 2 more novels, which I do like to call works of psychedelic fiction. But for the most part, my novels don't have a lot of readership, so I'm not really known as a novelist. That my nonfiction books about entheogens sell many orders of magnitude more than anybody who reads my novels. But that's basically how and why I got started in this area.